the Addiction Recovery Skills Workbook. Feel free to read ahead of this class, or if you want, what you can do is we'll go through this from front to back, and you can just come to the class and listen to it, and then it'll be perhaps easier to read that chapter after we go over it. It'll be like an intro to the chapter. So I'm going to start with the foreword of the Addiction Recovery Skills Workbook. I think that the first sentence is so powerful. I'm going to read it verbatim. What he says is, what the author says is, I remember in the 1980s being told by, the person who wrote the foreword, what they say is, I remember in the 1980s being told by a seasoned counselor that clients should not be educated about addiction because it would allow them to feel like they could understand and control their drug use or alcohol use, and would interfere with their surrendering to the disease. I found that to be really interesting because I really feel that learning the science of addiction and learning what research exists about addiction for me was really helpful. Look, I want to know where to bet my time on. So if I have questions about, do the 12 steps work, new in recovery, you're going to have questions about, do the 12 steps work, does therapy work, does a sober living home work? Because you're going to invest your time into it, and your money into it, and your energy into it. Does a rehab work? Does an aftercare program work? Does relapse prevention work? Does motivational interviewing work? You want to know those things before you jump into them. And so that's why the science of addiction is so important, because if there's a study that exists that says they took 1,000 people, split them up into two groups, 500 in one group and 500 in the other group, and they gave group A a medication and they gave group B no medication, and group A did 50% better than group B, I want to know that. Or if the group A went to a sober living home and at 6 months 50% of them did better than group B, I want to know that. So when we talk about the science of addiction, it's not just like the neuroscience of addiction, and it's not the type of science simply that's in a test tube. This is like science on human beings to see like what's worked for people, what hasn't. Now, there's also an importance in just having like conventional wisdom passed down from people that have been in recovery for 5 years, passing it down to people that have been in it for a year or for a couple months. Because to me also, what's going to inspire my confidence that somebody knows what they're talking about is that they've been where we've been, and they've survived, and they've made it. Like, to me, that speaks to me more than anything else. And then also, of course, the other things that exist. Now, I did mention the 12 steps. I do want to make it clear there's really good data showing that the 12-step program works. And so I wanted to make that clear. There's actually a paper that came out from a researcher in our department that showed that the 12-step program is indeed effective for helping people stay sober. All right, so that's what he starts off with, and we don't want this idea of like you need to follow me. Like this first sentence says, we don't want to educate the seasoned counselor that doesn't want to educate people about addiction because they don't want them to think that they can control it or empower them. We want to be able to empower people. We want to be able to educate them about addiction. We want them to be able to find out what works for them. A couple sentences down, this is beautiful, so I got to read it verbatim. It says, more recently, we hear celebrity endorsements for luxury treatment programs and quasi-religions which suggest that if you simply pay lots of money to these organizations and follow their science fiction or their narcissistically inspired formulas, it is very possible to become cured and avoid the hard work of recovery. So, you know, in the drug and alcohol game, there's a lot of money to be made. And also in the recovery game, it's important to recognize there's a lot of money to be made. So we should always be wary of people that say, I have the quick fix and nobody else has it. And, you know, there's money to be made, but there's also prestige and careers to be made. So in academia, in my world, you have people who will discredit something that's been working for a long time simply to sell a book or to get their name out there, to climb some sort of social academic ladder to success. So again, the science here is so important because then you can see on paper what works for most people and what's worth me investing my time in. Because if I'm going to roll the dice, or if I'm going to bet my money on something, I want to bet it on something that has good odds in it. And that's where knowing the science helps. I'm going to go to the second page of the foreword. Now, some questions they have are really helpful. So the reader is invited to join in the process of recovery, but at the same time, it is clearly acknowledged that there may be ambivalence, or they're two-minded about taking on this job of recovery. And then they start talking about questions, like natural questions that people have, like, is this whole recovery thing really necessary? I don't think there's anybody in this class who would say they didn't have this question at some point. The second question they ask is, do I really have a problem with drugs or alcohol? Like, can I just put it down? Or can I just have one on the weekends, or one every month? That's a question we wrestle with really for the rest of our lives, to be completely honest. Third question, why does my intention to occasionally slide into this out of control, compulsive, catastrophic, excessive use? The other question is, am I crazy? Like, is there something wrong with me? Like, am I born with something wrong with me? How can I tell if I'm addicted is another question. What does it mean to be addicted? So these are all questions that they start off with right off the bat. Like, it's normal to have these questions. And what's going to really answer those questions is gathering data from people that have more success than us. For the 1-monther, it's gathering data from people who've had 6 months or a year or 2 years. And this journey looks different the more we progress on it. Okay, the next chapter talks about what is this book about. Basically, it talks about, on the first paragraph on the next page, all kinds of tools to help people modify thoughts and beliefs, ways to build rewards and positive new behaviors into a life in recovery, strategies for managing negative mood states and coping, how to create a practical recovery plan. Look, the idea is simple. If you create a pros and cons list of what drugs and alcohol do for you, on the pros list, it helps me relax and unwind. It helps me have fun on the weekends. It's something to do. It helps me escape when life gets real stressful or just kind of whatever. And you can have that list go on. That list is now the list of coping strategies you need to develop to achieve those things without drugs, alcohol, or whatever your addictive behavior or substance is. So if it's a release, now we know we got to find something else to fill that. It could be exercise. It could be another hobby that we've gotten used to. If it's to manage mood, we got to figure out, we have to become emotionally competent. We can't just pretend like we can hard knock it all. We got to be aware of this complex emotional psychology thing that goes on inside us and figure out how to the jiu-jitsu to wrestle that and find peace with that. And then the cons, usually at this point, we're well aware of the cons early on. But then even that gets watered down and we forget about that as time progresses. But the cons are there to remind us of why we are doing this in the first place. And then the last part of this page says, there is no one school of thought that has all the answers, and there's no right way to recovery. Like, there's two groups in recovery. There's one group that says there's a menu of options, choose what works for you, but be realistic about it. If something doesn't work, add another tool. If that doesn't work, add another tool. And then there's a second group which is like, this is the only way, or our way is the only way, or our school of thought is the only thought. So beware of that, because, you know, you want to be open to what's worked for people. So keep your mind open and figure out what resonates with you. Okay, and that's the end of the foreword.